The village of St. Mary Mead possessed that peculiar quality of English countryside settlements where time seemed to move at its own gentle pace, unhurried by the modern world's increasing demands for haste. On this particular October evening, as the last golden light faded behind the ancient church spire, the newly opened midnight tea room glowed warmly from its position on the high street, its mullioned windows casting cheerful rectangles of amber light onto the cobblestones below. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her knitted shawl as she approached the establishment, her keen blue eyes taking in the unusual activity for such a late hour. The tea room, which had been the old apothecary shop until 6 months prior, had been transformed by its enterprising proprietress, Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell, into something rather revolutionary for their sleepy corner of England. A tea room that remained open until the scandalous hour of 10 o'clock, catering to what Cordelia rather grandly termed evening society. The transformation had not been without controversy. Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell had arrived in St. Mary Mead with considerable fanfare and even more considerable funds, purchasing not only the old apothecary building but also the adjacent cottage, which she had converted into private lodgings. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair arranged in an elaborate chignon and a tendency toward flowing scarves that suggested artistic pretensions. More significantly, she possessed that particular combination of wealth, confidence, and disregard for local customs that had made her both fascinating and slightly suspect to the established residents. Tonight's gathering had been billed as an autumn evening of literary appreciation, though Miss Marple suspected it was simply an excuse for the newer residents to mingle with the established families under the guise of culture. Not that she minded in the least. There was nothing quite so illuminating as observing people when they believed themselves to be performing for an audience. The interior of the midnight tea room was a curious blend of the building's Tudor origins and Cordelia's decidedly modern sensibilities. Heavy oak beams supported electric lighting fixtures imported from London, casting everything in a rather theatrical glow. Round tables draped in deep burgundy cloths were arranged throughout the main room, each adorned with a small lamp and a vase of late-blooming chrysanthemums. The effect was undeniably atmospheric, though Miss Marple couldn't help but notice how the dramatic lighting created as many shadows as it dispelled. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us," called Cordelia from behind the polished mahogany counter that dominated one wall. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and there was something almost feverish in her bright eyes as she surveyed her small but distinguished gathering. Miss Marple smiled and made her way toward a corner table, noting the other attendees with the casual interest of someone who had spent decades observing human nature. Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, Cordelia's husband and the village's rather pompous general practitioner, sat stiffly at the central table, his military bearing suggesting discomfort with his wife's theatrical tendencies. Near the window, Colonel Melchett engaged in quiet conversation with Mr. Clement, the vicar, their voices carrying the weight of men accustomed to being heard. At another table, Miss Lavinia Prescott, the village's self-appointed guardian of moral standards, surveyed the room with her usual expression of barely contained disapproval. Most intriguingly, young Timothy Hartwell, Cordelia's stepson from her husband's first marriage, sat alone near the fireplace, ostensibly reading but clearly more interested in observing the other patrons. There was something in his posture, a tension that suggested he was waiting for something, though what that might be remained unclear. "Such an interesting mix of people," murmured Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. "Cordelia has been quite mysterious about tonight's entertainment. Something about sharing discoveries she's made in researching local history." Before Miss Marple could respond, the gentle tinkling of a small bell drew their attention to the front of the room, where Cordelia had positioned herself near an ornate lectern. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she arranged several yellowed papers, and Miss Marple noticed that her usual theatrical confidence seemed somewhat forced this evening. "My dear friends," Cordelia began, her voice carrying clearly through the intimate space, I've gathered you here tonight for what I believe will be a most enlightening evening. As many of you know, I've been researching the history of our charming village, and I have discovered some absolutely fascinating documents among the papers left in the cottage I purchased." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room with what appeared to be calculated drama. Letters, diaries, and other materials that shed quite a different light on some of our most respected local families and their, shall we say, carefully guarded secrets. Miss Marple felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. There was something in Cordelia's tone, a note of barely contained triumph mixed with what might have been malice, that suggested this would be far more than a simple historical presentation. Around the room, she noticed subtle shifts, the way Dr. Hartwell's hand tightened around his brandy glass, how Colonel Melchett's usually relaxed posture became rigid, the manner in which Miss Prescott's lips pursed into an even thinner line. "Now, I'm sure you're all wondering what sort of revelations I might share," Cordelia continued, lifting one of the yellowed documents. "Let me begin with this fascinating excerpt from a diary dated 1923, which concerns a certain prominent family's rather creative approach to wartime profiteering. What happened next occurred with such shocking suddenness that later, when Inspector Slack arrived to take statements, there would be considerable disagreement about the exact sequence of events. Cordelia had just taken a sip from her special blend of evening tea, a concoction she had been particularly proud of, featuring herbs from her own garden, when her voice simply stopped. Not gradually, not with a cough or clearing of the throat, but as if someone had suddenly switched off a wireless. She stood perfectly still for a moment, the paper trembling in her hand, her eyes wide with what appeared to be surprise rather than pain. Then, quite suddenly, she swayed, her free hand reaching toward her throat in a gesture that was both delicate and desperate. The yellowed papers scattered like autumn leaves as she fell, her body striking the polished wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than physics would suggest possible. Dr. Hartwell was beside his wife in an instant, his medical training overriding whatever personal feelings might have complicated their marriage. He knelt, checked her pulse, listened for breathing, performed all the rituals that hope demands even when experience suggests futility. After what felt like an eternity but was likely no more than 2 minutes, he sat back on his heels, his face grave. "I'm afraid," he announced quietly, "that Cordelia is dead." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and Mrs. Bantry's sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her teacup balanced in her hands, but her sharp eyes were already cataloguing details that others, in their shock, might overlook. The way the papers had fallen in a perfect circle around Cordelia's body, as if deliberately scattered. The fact that her special tea blend remained untouched on the counter while her personal cup sat empty beside the lectern. And most interesting of all, the expression that had crossed young Timothy's face in the moment before his stepmother fell, not shock or grief, but something that looked remarkably like relief. As the other patrons began to react with varying degrees of horror and distress, Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic precision. The midnight tea room's first literary evening had indeed provided revelations, though not at all the sort that Cordelia Hartwell had intended to share. And Miss Marple, with the instincts honed by decades of observing human nature at its most unguarded moments, suspected that the evening's true drama was only just beginning. The village of St. Mary Mead had witnessed its share of unpleasant incidents over the years, but murder, for Miss Marple was quite certain that was what they were dealing with, had a way of revealing truths that polite society preferred to keep buried. As she watched the faces around her, noting who seemed genuinely shocked and who appeared to be performing shock, she reflected that Cordelia Hartwell's research into local secrets had perhaps uncovered more than even she had realized. The autumn evening that had begun with such civilized promise had taken a decidedly uncivilized turn, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair to observe how each member of their small gathering would respond to this most inconvenient development. The silence that followed Dr. Hartwell's pronouncement stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and Mrs. Bantry's sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple remained perfectly still in her corner chair, her teacup balanced in her hands, but her keen eyes were already cataloguing the subtle shifts in expression that crossed each face in the lamplit room. There was something rather telling about how people responded to sudden death. She had always found, particularly when that death occurred at a moment of high drama. Colonel Melchett was the first to recover his composure, rising from his chair with the military bearing that had served him through decades of crisis management. "We must telephone the police immediately," he declared, though Miss Marple noticed that his usual commanding tone carried an undertone of something that might have been relief. "Dr. Hartwell, you're quite certain there's nothing to be done?" Geoffrey Hartwell looked up from where he knelt beside his wife's still form, his medical training warring with what appeared to be a complex mixture of grief and something else entirely. "I'm afraid not, Colonel. She appears to have died quite suddenly." He paused, his professional composure struggling against more personal emotions. Her symptoms were most unusual, I must say. Not at all what one would expect from natural causes. Young Timothy Hartwell had moved closer to the scattered papers, though whether from concern or curiosity remained unclear to Miss Marple's observant eye. The relief she had glimpsed in his expression at the moment of his stepmother's collapse had been quickly replaced by something more appropriate to the circumstances, yet there remained a watchfulness about him that suggested a mind working through implications rather than simply processing grief. "Such a dreadful shock," murmured Mr. Clement, though Miss Marple detected a note in the vicar's voice that suggested the shock might not be entirely unwelcome. Poor Cordelia was so excited about sharing her historical discoveries with us all. Miss Lavinia Prescott had risen from her table and was surveying the scene with the air of someone whose dire predictions had been vindicated. "I did warn the parish council that these irregular evening entertainments were inappropriate for a respectable village," she declared with obvious satisfaction. "Nothing good ever comes of encouraging people to congregate at such unseemly hours, particularly when the entertainment involves stirring up matters better left buried." The observation struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing, not for its content, but for its timing. Most people, when confronted with sudden death, expressed sympathy for the deceased or concern for the living. Miss Prescott's immediate focus on social proprieties suggested either remarkable callousness or a mind already working to distance herself from any association with the evening's events. Dr. Hartwell had moved to the telephone behind the counter, and as his quiet conversation with the police station proceeded, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander over the fallen papers. From her position, she could make out fragments of different handwritings and paper types, some clearly modern, while others suggested greater antiquity. What struck her most forcibly, however, was the perfect circle in which they had fallen around Cordelia's body, as if deliberately scattered rather than simply dropped. "Inspector Slack will be here within the hour," Dr. Hartwell announced upon returning. "He's requested that we all remain here until his arrival, and that we disturb nothing." His eyes swept the room, lingering particularly on the scattered documents. Perhaps someone should gather those papers. They seem to have been quite important to Cordelia. "Oh, I shouldn't think we ought to touch anything," Mrs. Bantry interjected, having recovered somewhat from her initial shock. "Don't the police prefer to examine everything exactly as it was found?" "I remember reading something of the sort." Timothy stepped forward with what appeared to be helpful concern. "I could at least move them away from where stepmother fell. It seems rather disrespectful to leave them scattered about like that." Before anyone could respond, Colonel Melchett cleared his throat authoritatively. "Mrs. Bantry has the right of it. Best to leave everything precisely as it is." He paused, glancing around the room with a frown. "Though I must say, this is a most peculiar situation. Mrs. Hartwell seemed in perfect health when she began speaking." Miss Marple noticed subtle shifts in expression among the gathering at the Colonel's observation. Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while Miss Prescott developed a sudden fascination with her gloves. Most intriguingly, Timothy took a step back from the papers, as if the Colonel's words had reminded him of something significant. "She did seem rather excited about her presentation," offered Mr. Clement thoughtfully. "Perhaps the excitement proved too much for her constitution. Such things do happen, particularly in ladies who lead rather sedentary lives." The suggestion hung in the air with the weight of a reasonable explanation, and Miss Marple observed how readily several members of the group embraced it. Mrs. Bantry nodded sagely, while Miss Prescott made a small sound of agreement. The theory seemed to offer comfort in its ordinariness. Dr. Hartwell, however, shook his head slowly. "I examined Cordelia thoroughly just last month for her insurance renewal. Her heart was perfectly sound, her general health excellent." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note of professional puzzlement that Miss Marple found particularly interesting. "Her symptoms were more consistent with some form of poisoning, though I cannot imagine how such a thing could have occurred here." The word poisoning fell into the warm atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water. Miss Marple watched the ripples of reaction spread through the assembled company, noting who seemed genuinely shocked and who appeared to have been expecting such a revelation. Timothy had gone quite pale, while Miss Prescott's eyes sharpened with what looked remarkably like interest. Colonel Melchett assumed the expression of a man mentally reviewing everything he had observed, and Mrs. Bantry began looking around the room with the sudden awareness that she might be sharing space with a murderer. "But how could anyone have been poisoned here?" Mrs. Bantry asked, her voice higher than usual. "We all had tea from the same pot, didn't we?" Miss Marple had been wondering about this very point. "Actually," she said quietly, speaking for the first time since the tragedy, "I believe Mrs. Hartwell was drinking something different from the rest of us. She mentioned having her own special blend, didn't she? Something with herbs from her garden." Dr. Hartwell's expression grew thoughtful, as if her words had reminded him of something significant. "Yes, that's quite right. Cordelia was always experimenting with herbal teas. She grew quite a variety of plants behind the cottage, many of them rather unusual specimens she'd ordered from specialist nurseries." He paused, and Miss Marple detected concern in his voice. "Some of them were medicinal herbs, and one does have to be rather careful. The line between therapeutic and toxic can be surprisingly narrow." The sound of a motor car pulling up outside interrupted the increasingly tense atmosphere. Colonel Melchett moved to peer through the window. "That will be Inspector Slack," he announced with evident relief. As footsteps approached the door, Miss Marple took one final look around the room, noting positions, expressions, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled tension. The door opened with a sharp chime, and Inspector Slack entered with his usual air of aggressive competence, followed by Constable Lake. "Right then," Slack announced, surveying the scene with practiced efficiency. "What have we got here?" His gaze took in the body, the scattered papers, and the assembled faces with equal attention. "Dr. Hartwell, I assume you've made the preliminary examination." "Indeed, Inspector. Mrs. Hartwell appears to have died suddenly, possibly from some form of poisoning. She had been drinking from her own special tea blend when she collapsed." Slack's eyebrows rose slightly. "Poison, you say? Well, that does complicate matters." He moved to examine the teacup beside the lectern, lifting it carefully. "And this would be the cup in question?" "Yes, Inspector. She had prepared it herself earlier this evening. A special herbal blend, quite different from what we served the guests." As Inspector Slack began his preliminary investigation, Miss Marple settled back to observe. The official inquiry was beginning, but she suspected the real mystery lay not in determining how Cordelia had died, but in understanding why someone had felt it necessary to prevent her from sharing whatever revelations those scattered papers contained. By morning, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed that only truly shocking events could achieve. Mrs. Giles at the post office had heard it from young Rose, who had been released after giving her statement to the police. The baker's wife learned it from the milkman, who had seen the police cars and the ambulance. By the time the church bells chimed 8 o'clock, there wasn't a household in the village that hadn't heard some version of the tale. "Poison, they're saying," Mrs. Bantry reported to Miss Marple over morning tea. "Right there in her own special blend. And after she'd been threatening to expose all those old secrets, too. Someone must have been very keen indeed to keep those particular skeletons in their closets." Miss Marple listened with the patience of someone who understood that village gossip, however inaccurate in its details, often contained valuable grains of truth about human nature and hidden relationships. The sudden death of the flamboyant Mrs. Hartswell had stripped away the veneer of civility, exposing the raw nerves and simmering tensions that were always present just beneath the surface of village life. As she tended her roses later that morning, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's events. Cordelia Hartwell had arrived in St. Mary Mead like someone setting up a mirror where people preferred painted screens. Someone had been very anxious indeed to shatter that mirror at precisely the right moment, and Miss Marple intended to discover who had possessed both the motive and the opportunity to turn an evening of literary appreciation into a tragedy that would haunt the village for years to come. The village clock had barely chimed midnight when the news of Cordelia Hartwell's sudden death began its inevitable journey through the narrow lanes and cottage windows of St. Mary Mead. By dawn, there wasn't a household that hadn't heard some version of the tale, each retelling adding its own particular emphasis or interpretation. Miss Marple, who had always found that the immediate aftermath of shocking events revealed as much about human nature as the events themselves, made her way to the post office early, ostensibly to collect her correspondence, but primarily to observe how the village was processing this most unwelcome development. Mrs. Giles, the postmistress, was already deep in animated conversation with Mrs. Long when Miss Marple arrived. The two women were discussing the tragedy with the mixture of horror and fascination that such events invariably produced in small communities. "Poison, they're saying," Mrs. Giles whispered, though her voice carried perfectly across the small space. "Right there in her own special tea blend, and after she'd been threatening to expose all those old secrets too. Someone must have been very keen indeed to keep certain matters buried." Mrs. Long wrung her hands nervously. "But who would do such a dreadful thing? I mean, Mrs. Hartwell could be rather dramatic, perhaps, but surely not enough to drive someone to murder." Miss Marple purchased her stamps and listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that village gossip, however inaccurate in its details, often contained valuable insights into the relationships and tensions that lay beneath the surface of daily life. The consensus seemed to be that Cordelia Hartwell, for all her charm and social ambitions, had been sailing rather too close to dangerous waters with her historical research. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack had returned to the midnight tea room with Constable Lake and Dr. Pemberton, the county medical examiner. Miss Marple, happening to pass by on her way to tend her roses, observed through the mullioned windows as the three men conducted a more thorough examination of the scene. The autumn sunlight, pale and uncommitted, revealed the room not as the romantic setting Cordelia had so carefully arranged, but as a collection of surfaces and corners where evidence might hide. She noticed Inspector Slack paying particular attention to the lectern where Cordelia had stood, examining something with a magnifying glass. Later, when Mrs. Bantry stopped by for their usual morning chat, she reported that Rose Wheeler, the young waitress, had been asked to return to demonstrate exactly how she had served the tea and arranged the various items on the tables. The inspector was most interested in that sugar bowl, Mrs. Bantry confided as they sat in Miss Marple's sitting room. Apparently, there were some irregularities in the sugar cubes themselves. Some were perfectly uniform, while others appeared to have been broken or, perhaps, altered in some way. Miss Marple found this information particularly intriguing. She had observed the night before that Cordelia never took sugar in her tea, yet a sugar bowl had been prominently placed on the lectern. The presence of irregular sugar pieces suggested someone had been doing more than simply sweetening their beverage. The medical examination had also yielded significant results. Dr. Pemberton's preliminary findings, as discreetly shared with Dr. Hartwell and subsequently overheard by several interested parties, confirmed that Cordelia had indeed died from digitalis poisoning. The foxglove plant, common in cottage gardens throughout the countryside, contained compounds that in small doses could treat heart conditions, but in larger quantities proved rapidly fatal. What made this discovery particularly significant was Inspector Slack's subsequent examination of Cordelia's herb garden behind the cottage. The neat rows of medicinal plants included several varieties of foxglove, and there was clear evidence that someone had been harvesting from them recently. Stems had been cut cleanly with a sharp knife rather than broken naturally, and the pattern of harvesting suggested someone with knowledge of which parts of the plant contained the highest concentration of active compounds. More intriguingly, when Constable Lake searched the cottage's kitchen, he discovered Cordelia's collection of dried herbs stored in a wooden box with carefully labeled packets. One packet, originally marked foxglove, had been crudely scratched through and relabeled "not for tea" in what appeared to be Cordelia's own handwriting. This suggested she had been aware of the plant's dangerous properties and had taken precautions to avoid accidental poisoning. The investigation had also revealed troubling inconsistencies regarding the documents Cordelia had planned to share. Timothy Hartwell, when questioned more thoroughly, admitted that his stepmother had been working with a substantial collection of historical materials, including letters, diary entries, and official records dating primarily from the early 1920s. However, when Inspector Slack examined the papers collected from the scene, several items appeared to be missing. Miss Marple had noticed the night before that the pages scattered around Cordelia's body had been numbered in neat pencil marks, but there was a curious gap in the sequence, jumping from page 7 directly to page 9. This suggested that at least one crucial document had been removed, either during the confusion following Cordelia's collapse or possibly even before the evening's presentation began. The scope of Cordelia's research was becoming clearer through the inspector's methodical questioning of witnesses. She had been investigating local families and their activities during and immediately after the Great War, focusing particularly on financial dealings and property transactions that might not have been entirely above board. Her trips to London and the county archives had apparently uncovered discrepancies in official records that could prove embarrassing, or worse, for several prominent families in the area. As Miss Marple tended her garden that afternoon, she reflected on the pattern of reactions she had observed among the witnesses. Dr. Hartwell's professional demeanor seemed to mask deeper anxieties about his wife's research activities. Colonel Melchett had been unusually eager to accept natural causes as an explanation, despite the obvious signs of foul play. Miss Prescott's disapproval of the evening's entertainment had seemed to go beyond mere social propriety, suggesting personal concerns about what might be revealed. Most intriguingly, young Timothy's behavior continued to puzzle her. His obvious relief at his stepmother's death had been quickly replaced by what appeared to be genuine anxiety about the investigation's direction. When she had encountered him outside the greengrocer's that morning, he had seemed almost fearful, avoiding eye contact and hurrying away as if anxious to escape questioning. The teacup itself had yielded additional clues upon closer examination. Inspector Slack had discovered a faint residue around the inside rim that appeared to be the remains of something granular that had been dissolved, but not completely. Given Cordelia's well-known aversion to sugar in her tea, this residue suggested that someone had added something to her drink without her knowledge. The timing of the poisoning was also significant. The digitalis had acted with remarkable speed, suggesting either a very large dose or a particularly concentrated preparation. Someone with medical knowledge would have understood exactly how much was needed to ensure rapid death while minimizing the victim's opportunity to call for help or identify her attacker. As evening approached and the village settled into its usual quiet routine, Miss Marple found herself considering not just who had committed this crime, but why they had chosen this particular moment to act. Cordelia's theatrical presentation had been carefully planned, complete with numbered documents and dramatic revelations. Someone had been equally careful in planning her silencing, choosing a method that would appear accidental while ensuring that her dangerous secrets died with her. The investigation was entering a crucial phase, with Inspector Slack preparing to conduct formal interviews with each of the witnesses. Miss Marple suspected that these conversations would reveal layers of motive and opportunity that extended far beyond the obvious suspects. In her experience, murder in a small village was rarely a simple matter of individual grievance, but rather the culmination of complex relationships and long-buried resentments that could take years to fully understand. The midnight tea room remained closed, its windows dark and its secrets temporarily sealed behind police tape. But Miss Marple knew that the real mystery lay not in the physical evidence, important though it was, but in the human hearts and minds that had been present that fateful evening. Someone among their small gathering had been desperate enough to commit murder and patient enough to plan it carefully. The challenge now was to identify which of their neighbors had crossed that terrible line between respectability and violence, and what secret had been worth killing to protect. The following morning brought a transformation to the midnight tea room that would have appalled its late proprietress. Inspector Slack had arranged the space with the functional efficiency of a man more concerned with extracting truth than preserving atmosphere. 2 small tables had been positioned near the lectern where Cordelia had made her final, interrupted presentation, and 3 chairs formed a severe triangle that suggested interrogation rather than conversation. The romantic lighting had been replaced by harsh electric bulbs that cast everything in stark relief, revealing details that the previous evening's theatrical ambience had mercifully concealed. Miss Marple, who had been asked to remain available for questioning, positioned herself quietly near the hearth with her knitting bag, though her needles remained conspicuously idle. She had learned long ago that people revealed far more about themselves when they believed they were unobserved, and the formal interview process provided an excellent opportunity for such observation. Constable Lake took his position by the door with the stolid patience of a man accustomed to watching and waiting, while Inspector Slack arranged his notebook and pencil with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to criminal investigation. The room still carried the faint scent of yesterday's tea and the lingering presence of interrupted intentions, with Cordelia's teacup resting on the lectern like a small monument to ambitions that would never be fulfilled. Rose Wheeler was summoned first, entering with the white-faced composure of someone who had spent a sleepless night contemplating her proximity to murder. Her apron was crisp and perfectly tied, but Miss Marple noticed the way she twisted its hem with nervous fingers as she settled into the chair opposite Inspector Slack. "Now then, Miss Wheeler," Slack began with businesslike efficiency, "I want you to walk me through your preparations for yesterday evening, particularly anything concerning the lectern arrangement." Rose's voice was steady but quiet as she recounted her duties. "I laid out everything as Mrs. Hartwell requested, sir. The cup and saucer, the small jug of milk, and the sugar bowl, though I did think it odd since Mrs. Hartwell never took sugar in her tea." Inspector Slack's pencil paused over his notebook. "You're certain about Mrs. Hartwell's preferences regarding sugar?" "Oh, yes, sir. She was quite particular about it. Said sugar corrupted the natural flavors of her special blends. That's why I was surprised when Miss Prescott specifically requested that I include the complete tea service on the lectern." This information clearly interested the inspector. "Miss Prescott requested the sugar bowl be placed there?" "Yes, sir. She stopped by the counter perhaps 15 minutes before the presentation began and said it would look more civilized to have the complete setting displayed. Said it looked slovenly to leave things half done." Rose glanced nervously toward the door as if expecting Miss Prescott to materialize and correct her account. "And while you were arranging the lectern, did anyone else approach or handle any of the items?" Rose considered carefully before responding. Only Mr. Timothy came up to ask about coffee service. I told him Mrs. Hartwell had strong views about coffee in the evenings, but he didn't touch anything on the lectern. When Rose was dismissed, Dr. Hartwell took her place with the rigid bearing of a man accustomed to professional scrutiny, but clearly uncomfortable with its current application. His hands, folded precisely on the table before him, betrayed a slight tremor that Miss Marple found most revealing. Inspector Slack's questions were clinical and direct. "Dr. Hartwell, your medical training would make you familiar with digitalis and its effects, would it not?" "Naturally, Inspector. Any general practitioner would recognize the symptoms of cardiac glycoside poisoning. During the war, we encountered various forms of poisoning, both accidental and deliberate." His voice carried the controlled tone of someone determined to appear cooperative while revealing as little as possible. "And you identified your wife's symptoms as digitalis poisoning almost immediately." The presentation was quite classic, I'm afraid. Rapid onset, the particular pallor, the way she grasped at her throat. Unfortunately, by the time I reached her, it was already too late for any intervention. Slack leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Hartwell, I understand your wife had been conducting research into local history, particularly events from the war years. Did she discuss her findings with you?" Miss Marple observed the subtle shift in the doctor's expression, noting how his professional mask slipped momentarily to reveal something that might have been fear or perhaps resignation. Cordelia was enthusiastic about local history, Inspector, sometimes overly so. She had a tendency to see conspiracies and scandals where more mundane explanations would suffice. "Did her research concern your family's activities during the war?" Dr. Hartwell rose abruptly and moved to the window overlooking the village green. "Inspector, my conduct during the war was entirely proper. I served as a medical officer with distinction, and my record is unblemished." "I'm not questioning your military service, Doctor. I'm asking whether your wife might have uncovered information that could prove embarrassing or damaging to yourself or others in the village." The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. When Dr. Hartwell finally turned back to face his questioner, Miss Marple noted that his composure had been restored, but the effort was clearly visible. Cordelia was determined to present her findings regardless of the potential consequences to living persons. I warned her that stirring up old matters might cause unnecessary distress, but she seemed to believe that historical truth was more important than present-day sensibilities. The interview revealed that Dr. Hartwell had prepared Cordelia's special tea blend himself that evening, using dried herbs from their garden, and that he had been called away to attend to an emergency just as the presentation began. This timing struck Miss Marple as either remarkably convenient or suspiciously calculated. Timothy Hartwell entered the interview space with the defensive air of someone expecting accusation. His face had aged considerably since the previous evening, and he carried himself with the hunched shoulders of barely controlled anxiety. Inspector Slack dispensed with preliminaries, cutting directly to the heart of his concerns. "Mr. Hartwell, there had been tension between yourself and your stepmother regarding financial matters. Had there not?" Timothy flushed, but answered steadily. "I had requested access to a small inheritance from my mother to pay for additional tutoring. Cordelia declined, saying she would determine what was necessary and when. I may have called her unreasonable, but that hardly constitutes grounds for murder." "Where were you when Mrs. Hartwell collapsed?" "By the fireplace, reading. Then I moved forward with everyone else when she fell." Timothy's eyes flickered involuntarily toward the neat stack of papers on the side table. "I admit I picked up one of the scattered documents. It had my name on it, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I put it in my pocket because I didn't want others to see it at such a moment." Inspector Slack extended his hand with quiet authority. After a long hesitation, Timothy withdrew a folded sheet from his jacket pocket. Miss Marple could see the penciled number 8 circled in the upper corner as Slack examined the document, his expression growing more serious as he read. The paper appeared to contain references to financial irregularities involving several local families during the post-war period, with particular attention to property acquisitions that might not have been entirely legitimate. Timothy's name appeared in connection with a trust fund that had been established using money of questionable origin. Miss Prescott's interview provided the most theatrical moment of the morning. She entered the space with the bearing of someone accustomed to moral authority and took her seat with obvious reluctance to justify her actions to anyone. When questioned about requesting the sugar bowl be placed on the lectern, she responded with characteristic directness. "One likes things done properly, Inspector. There is a correct way to arrange a tea service and an incorrect way." Mrs. Hartwell's standards were sometimes modern. Her tone suggested that modern was synonymous with deplorable. "Did you approach the lectern at any time during the evening?" I adjusted the chrysanthemums. They were arranged in a distressingly unbalanced fashion that blocked the view from several tables. Miss Prescott's eyes narrowed as if daring anyone to question her aesthetic judgment. When Inspector Slack pressed her about her movements near the sugar bowl, Miss Prescott's response was sharp with indignation. "Inspector, you cannot seriously be suggesting that I administered poison to Mrs. Hartwell in full view of the clergy and half the village council." As the formal interviews concluded, Inspector Slack stood, with his hands in his pockets, and surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had assembled a clear picture of events. His voice carried the weight of official conclusion when he addressed the assembled witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a method that points to careful planning. Digitalis is not a substance one encounters by accident. We have a means of administration through the sugar bowl that suggests knowledge of the victim's habits. We have a missing document recovered from the pocket of a young man who had quarreled with the deceased and stood to benefit from preventing certain revelations. The evidence points to a clear conclusion." Miss Marple remained seated as the others began to disperse, her keen eyes taking in the subtle reactions to Inspector Slack's implicit accusation. Dr. Hartwell's relief was almost palpable, while Timothy's face had gone ashen with the realization that he had become the primary suspect. Miss Prescott gathered her belongings with the brisk efficiency of someone eager to distance herself from unpleasant associations. When the room had largely cleared, Miss Marple approached Inspector Slack with the diffident manner of someone uncertain of her welcome. "You will forgive an old woman's curiosity, Inspector, but sometimes the method of a crime reveals as much about the perpetrator as the motive itself." Slack regarded her with the patience he might show to a well-meaning but irrelevant elderly relative. "Have you a particular observation, Miss Marple?" "Only that Mrs. Hartwell never took sugar in her tea, as everyone who knew her was aware. Someone who relied on the sugar bowl to deliver poison might be either unfamiliar with her habits or deliberately counting on others to notice the sugar and draw their own conclusions." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he would give her observation due consideration, which Miss Marple understood to mean he would ignore it entirely in favor of his more straightforward theory. As the official investigation continued its methodical course, she requested permission to retrieve her knitting bag, which she had deliberately left near the lectern. Alone for a precious few moments in the room where tragedy had unfolded, Miss Marple moved with careful purpose toward the arrangement of items on the lectern. The teacup, still bearing the faint trace of Cordelia's lipstick, sat beside its saucer, the milk jug, and the contested sugar bowl. The sugar tongs lay diagonally across the bowl's rim, not squarely as a practiced hand would naturally place them, but at an angle that suggested hasty or unfamiliar use. Miss Marple stood perfectly still, her head tilted as if listening for sounds beyond the range of normal hearing. People revealed their habits in the smallest gestures, she reflected, and handedness was not easily disguised when one was otherwise occupied with deception. She remembered clearly how Miss Prescott had adjusted the chrysanthemums with quick, precise movements of her left hand while holding her reticule in her right, and how Timothy, that very morning, had counted coins with his right hand while his left remained idle. Without touching the evidence, she leaned closer to examine the teacup's interior rim. There, barely visible, was the faintest roughness where something granular had lingered before dissolving. On the lectern's surface, near where the papers had been arranged, a few tiny crystals caught the light, perhaps scattered from nervous fingers handling the sugar tongs in haste. As evening approached and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple paid a social call on Miss Prescott, whose trim house reflected the same rigid orderliness as its owner's personality. The drawing room smelled of lavender and furniture polish, everything in its proper place with military precision. Miss Prescott, though clearly surprised by the visit, was too well bred to deny hospitality. As she prepared tea, Miss Marple observed her movements with particular interest. When Miss Prescott lifted the sugar tongs to inquire about preferences, her left hand trembled just enough to make the silver implements click against the porcelain bowl. "None for me, my dear," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I'm trying to be very good about such things." "Quite wise," Miss Prescott responded with a tight smile of her own. "Sugar corrupts both the palate and the character, I've always maintained." Miss Marple's gaze wandered with apparent casualness to a small writing desk by the window, where a sheet of notepaper displayed columns of neatly numbered lines. The sequence ran from 1 to 12, then continued awkwardly to 14, conspicuously omitting 13 entirely. Whether from superstition or more practical concerns, the missing number suggested someone who understood the importance of proper sequence and the power of strategic omission. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple paused to admire a photograph on the hall table showing a young man in military uniform. "Your brother?" she inquired politely. "My father," Miss Prescott replied curtly, "a man of unwavering principle." "How fortunate for your family," Miss Marple murmured. So many households were tested during those difficult years after the war. Property changing hands, prices fluctuating wildly, confusing times for those who preferred the old ways of doing things. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. Inspector Slack's case against Timothy Hartwell was circumstantially strong, but psychologically unsatisfying. The young man's clumsy attempt at concealment and obvious fear suggested guilt of some kind, but not necessarily the guilt of murder. Similarly, Dr. Hartwell's medical knowledge and strained marriage made him a logical suspect, but his absence during the crucial moments and his professional precision suggested someone who would choose a less conspicuous method if he intended harm. Miss Prescott's fussiness about proper arrangements and her obvious disapproval of Cordelia's unconventional approach to village life painted a picture of someone who might indeed substitute one arrangement for another, correcting what she perceived as improprieties while preventing greater indignities from being revealed. But the true test would come in understanding not just who could have committed such a crime, but who would have felt compelled to act at that precise moment, with those particular witnesses present. The missing page 8 of Cordelia's presentation remained the key to understanding the killer's motivation. Whatever revelation it contained had been important enough to justify murder, and someone had been prepared with both the means and the opportunity to prevent its disclosure. As Miss Marple reached her garden gate, she made a mental note to speak with Mr. Clement about Cordelia's exact words at the beginning of her presentation, and whether there had been any hint about which family's secrets she intended to expose first. In her experience, the arrangement of evidence could be as revealing as the evidence itself, and someone had been very careful indeed about what they wanted the investigation to discover, and what they were determined to keep hidden. The next morning arrived with that peculiar clarity that often follows village tragedies when ordinary routines continue but carry an undercurrent of unease that touches every conversation and glance. Miss Marple found herself drawn to her garden earlier than usual, ostensibly to tend her late-blooming roses, but primarily to observe the subtle changes in the village's daily rhythm that invariably followed significant events. From her position among the flower beds, she had an excellent view of the comings and goings along the high street, and what she observed confirmed several suspicions that had been forming in her methodical mind. Dr. Hartwell emerged from his surgery at precisely 8:30, his medical bag in hand, and his bearing suggesting a man determined to maintain normal routines despite extraordinary circumstances. Yet there was something in his manner, a barely perceptible lightening of his usual gravity, that suggested Inspector Slack's focus on Timothy had provided him with considerable relief. When Mrs. Clement approached him with obvious sympathy, his response was polite but brief, and he continued his rounds with what appeared to be genuine eagerness to escape further condolences. More intriguingly, Miss Prescott had abandoned her usual morning schedule entirely. Instead of her customary visit to the post office at 9 o'clock sharp, she remained within her cottage, though Miss Marple could see her silhouette moving restlessly from window to window as if keeping watch for something or someone. This deviation from established routine was significant in someone whose life was governed by rigid adherence to proper schedules and social obligations. Timothy Hartwell presented the most interesting case study in behavioral change. Rather than skulking about the village with the furtive air of someone avoiding attention, he had positioned himself conspicuously at the bus stop, apparently waiting for the morning service to the county seat. His posture suggested someone who had reached a decision of considerable importance, and when the bus arrived, he boarded with the determined air of someone embarking on a mission rather than simply fleeing from unpleasant circumstances. Miss Marple's contemplation of these developments was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who approached through the garden gate with the purposeful stride of someone bearing significant news. Her cheeks were flushed with the excitement that accompanied the possession of information others had not yet acquired, and she settled onto the garden bench with the satisfaction of someone about to discharge an important duty. "Jane, you simply must hear what I've discovered about Cordelia's research activities," she announced without preamble. Mrs. Wheeler mentioned that Cordelia had been corresponding with someone at the War Office regarding property transactions during the demobilization period. Rose had been instructed to post several letters marked official business and to collect responses from a private box at the county post office rather than having them delivered to the cottage. This information struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. The private postal arrangement suggested Cordelia had been concerned about local interference with her correspondence, which indicated both the sensitivity of her discoveries and her awareness that someone might attempt to prevent their revelation. It also suggested her investigation had progressed far beyond casual historical curiosity into matters that might have official implications. After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Mr. Clement was attempting, with limited success, to compose his Sunday sermon. He greeted her with obvious relief, clearly eager for a distraction from the theological implications of murder within his congregation. "I was hoping you might recall a little more about Mrs. Hartwell's exact words that evening, just before the tragedy," Miss Marple said gently, accepting his offer of tea. "She spoke of letters and diaries, I believe." Mr. Clement's brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes, she was rather dramatic about it all. She mentioned shedding quite a different light on some of our most respected local families and their carefully guarded secrets. Then she said something about beginning with a diary excerpt from 1923 concerning a certain prominent family's rather creative approach to wartime profiteering." He paused, then added thoughtfully, "She also mentioned having both church records and apothecary ledgers to corroborate her findings. Said something about the old apothecary keeping better records than expected." Miss Marple found this detail particularly illuminating. The combination of church records and apothecary ledgers would provide an unusually comprehensive view of village financial activities during the post-war period, when property values fluctuated wildly and opportunities for questionable transactions abounded. Her visit to the vicarage was followed by an unexpected encounter with Constable Lake, who approached her on the high street with the diffident manner of someone seeking unofficial guidance. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but the inspector asked me to mention that we've made an interesting discovery at the tea room. Found something tucked behind the parish magazines on the shelf near the lectern." The discovery proved to be an envelope of stiff blue paper containing what appeared to be a formal agreement dated June 1923. The document, headed Memorandum of Understanding, detailed the transfer of Daisyfield Cottage and an adjoining parcel at a price substantially below market value in exchange for continued discretion regarding certain supply irregularities during wartime. The names given were Arthur Prescott and Edwin Whittle, the former proprietor of the apothecary shop. This revelation transformed the entire complexion of the investigation. Miss Prescott's father had apparently been involved in questionable wartime activities that required ongoing concealment, and Cordelia's research had uncovered documentary evidence of these irregularities. The blue memorandum provided not just historical gossip, but potential grounds for criminal charges, depending on the nature of the original misconduct. Inspector Slack's satisfaction with this discovery was evident when Miss Marple encountered him later that afternoon. "Changes everything, doesn't it?" he remarked with obvious pleasure. "Gives us a clear motive for someone wanting to prevent Mrs. Hartwell's presentation. Can't have been comfortable for Miss Prescott, knowing her family's dirty laundry was about to be aired in public." However, Miss Marple's attention remained focused on the physical evidence from the crime scene itself. The arrangement of items on the lectern continued to puzzle her, particularly the positioning of the sugar tongs and the faint residue in Cordelia's teacup. Someone had been very careful about creating the appearance of natural death while ensuring the poison reached its intended target at precisely the right moment. By late afternoon, news arrived that Timothy had not fled, but had instead presented himself at the county courthouse with a solicitor and a substantial collection of documents. The papers included correspondence between himself and Cordelia, revealing that she had initially approached him as a potential ally in exposing financial irregularities, not as a target of her investigation. Timothy had been collaborating with her research, which explained both his presence at the presentation and his desperate attempt to conceal evidence before the proper authorities could be notified. This development eliminated Timothy as a suspect while confirming the scope of Cordelia's investigation. She had been conducting a systematic inquiry into post-war financial irregularities involving multiple local families, with evidence substantial enough to support criminal charges if properly presented to the authorities. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself considering not just who had committed the crime, but how they had managed to administer the poison with such precision. The digitalis had acted with remarkable speed, suggesting either a very large dose or a particularly concentrated preparation. Someone with medical knowledge would have understood exactly how much was needed to ensure rapid death, while minimizing the victim's opportunity to call for help or identify her attacker. The timing remained crucial. For the poison to act so quickly, it must have been administered very shortly before Cordelia's collapse, perhaps while she was distracted by her presentation. The sugar bowl, insisted upon by Miss Prescott, despite Cordelia's known aversion to sugar, provided the perfect vehicle for concealing and delivering a lethal dose. Walking home through the quiet lanes as dusk gathered, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern of evidence that was emerging. The crime had required not just medical knowledge and opportunity, but also the psychological sophistication to manipulate the investigation's initial direction. Someone had been very careful indeed about what they wanted discovered and what they were determined to keep hidden. The killer had counted on a simple narrative, an obvious suspect with clear motive, supported by physical evidence that seemed to tell a straightforward story. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most carefully planned crimes often defeated themselves through their very sophistication, leaving traces that simpler minds would never have created. The challenge now was to identify which of their neighbors possessed both the knowledge necessary to commit such a precise crime and the desperation to risk everything in preventing certain secrets from seeing the light of day. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a more direct approach to testing her growing suspicions about the true identity of Cordelia Hartwell's killer. The following morning brought with it a peculiar clarity that Miss Marple had learned to associate with the moments when a complex puzzle begins to resolve itself into recognizable patterns. Her first destination was the midnight tea room, where Rose Wheeler was attempting to restore some semblance of order to the establishment that had become the center of such unwelcome attention. The young woman greeted Miss Marple with obvious relief, clearly grateful for a visitor who represented normalcy rather than official inquiry. "I've been thinking about what you mentioned yesterday, Miss Marple, regarding Mrs. Hartwell's particular ways. With her herbs," Rose began without preamble, her hands busy with unnecessary tidying. "There's something that's been troubling me about that packet the inspector showed everyone, the one marked 'Not for Tea.'" Miss Marple settled herself in the chair nearest the counter, her attention focused entirely on Rose's increasingly animated explanation. Mrs. Hartwell was ever so particular about her labeling, you see, always used proper Latin names when she could, and when she wrote warnings, it was always "not for infusion" in that careful script of hers. She kept spare labels in a little wooden box and would never, ever scratch through one like that. Said it looked slovenly. This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. People who delighted in theatrical presentation and careful arrangement did not deface their work with hasty corrections. They replaced what displeased them entirely. "You're quite certain about her usual phrasing, Rose?" "Oh, yes, miss. She was always saying how tea was for proper tea and everything else was a tisane or an infusion. Very precise about it, she was, and that scratched-through label looked like someone had written it in a hurry. Not at all like Mrs. Hartwell's usual hand." Armed with this crucial insight, Miss Marple made her way to Dr. Hartwell's surgery, where she found him attending to the morning's roster of patients with what appeared to be determined normalcy. When she requested a moment of his time regarding a persistent shoulder complaint, he welcomed her with professional courtesy, though she detected an underlying tension in his manner that had not been present in their previous encounters. As he conducted his examination with practiced efficiency, Miss Marple engaged him in the sort of gentle conversation that elderly patients were expected to initiate. "Such precise timing Mrs. Hartwell's illness showed, Doctor. The digitalis must have been administered in exactly the right quantity to act so quickly." Dr. Hartwell's hands paused almost imperceptibly in their work. The cardiac glycosides are indeed predictable in their effects when one understands the pharmacology involved. Any physician would recognize the symptoms and the likely dosage required. Of course, though I imagine calculating such things requires considerable expertise. Too little, and there might be time for intervention. Too much, and the circumstances might appear suspicious rather than natural. Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but she observed his reflection in the surgery's mirror with careful attention. "Medical training provides one with an understanding of therapeutic dosages and their variations," he replied, completing his examination with perhaps more haste than thoroughness warranted. "Your shoulder appears to be suffering from simple muscular tension, Miss Marple. Rest should prove sufficient." Her next call took her to Mrs. Bantry, whose drawing room had become an informal headquarters for village intelligence gathering. "Jane, you simply must hear what Mrs. Wheeler mentioned about that sugar bowl business," she announced, before Miss Marple had properly settled herself. Apparently, Miss Prescott specifically requested that the complete tea service be displayed on the lectern, despite everyone knowing that Cordelia never took sugar. Said it was a matter of proper etiquette. Miss Marple found this information particularly illuminating when considered alongside her growing understanding of the crime's mechanics. Someone familiar with Cordelia's habits would have known the sugar bowl would remain untouched, making it an ideal vehicle for concealing evidence of tampering. And Rose noticed irregularities in the sugar cubes themselves. Indeed, some appeared to have been broken or perhaps replaced with others of slightly different size, as if someone had been selective about which pieces remained in the bowl. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer conspiratorially. "And there's something else. Mrs. Pierce saw someone near Cordelia's cottage yesterday evening, slipping through the garden, a woman in dark clothing, moving rather purposefully toward the back entrance. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's own cottage. Timothy Hartwell arrived with the nervous energy of someone bearing important news, accompanied by a grave-looking gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Pembroke, a solicitor from the county seat. Timothy's earlier cooperation with the authorities had apparently yielded significant results. "Miss Marple, we've discovered something rather important about stepmother's research," Timothy began, producing a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. She had prepared a summary of her most significant findings, the document she planned to present first. "It concerns not just Miss Prescott's father, but several other families as well, including—" He hesitated, glancing at the solicitor, "including irregularities in medical supply distributions during the war years." Mr. Pembroke nodded gravely. Mrs. Hartwell had been corresponding with the War Office regarding discrepancies in pharmaceutical records. Apparently, certain medical officers had been diverting controlled substances for civilian use, creating a rather profitable black market during the post-war shortages. Miss Marple accepted this information with the calm attention she always accorded significant revelations, though inwardly she felt the satisfaction of seeing another piece of the puzzle settle into place. Cordelia's research had threatened not just Miss Prescott's family reputation, but potentially Dr. Hartwell's professional standing and personal freedom. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological profile of someone who would commit such a precisely planned murder. The killer had demonstrated medical knowledge, intimate familiarity with the victim's habits, and the ability to manipulate physical evidence to direct suspicion elsewhere. They had also shown remarkable composure under pressure, maintaining normal behavior while conducting a complex deception. The forged warning label suggested someone who understood Cordelia's usual methods, but had been forced to work quickly under stressful circumstances. The insistence on proper tea service etiquette provided cover for placing the sugar bowl within easy reach while creating the appearance of social propriety. Most tellingly, the killer had chosen a method that would appear to be death from natural causes, while ensuring they could not be held responsible for failing to provide medical assistance. Walking through the quiet village lanes as dusk gathered, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had revealed layers of deception and hidden relationships that extended far beyond the obvious suspects. Someone among their small community had been desperate enough to commit murder and sophisticated enough to plan it carefully, counting on village assumptions and official procedures to conceal their crime. The challenge now was to identify which of their neighbors possessed both the technical knowledge and psychological desperation necessary for such an act, and to understand what specific revelation in Cordelia's research had been worth killing to prevent. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a more direct approach to testing her developing theory about the true identity of Cordelia Hartwell's murderer. The village clock chimed 9 as she reached her garden gate, and Miss Marple paused to observe the lights beginning to appear in cottage windows throughout St. Mary Mead. Behind one of those windows sat someone who believed they had committed the perfect crime, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that perfection in human affairs was an illusion that invariably betrayed itself through the very precision of its execution. The morning brought with it an urgency that Miss Marple had not anticipated, though in retrospect she realized she should have expected the killer to make another move. The investigation had reached a point where maintaining the carefully constructed deception would require increasingly desperate measures, and desperate people, in her long experience, rarely maintained the precision that had characterized their initial crimes. The first sign of this desperation came at 6:30, when the acrid smell of burning paper drifted through her bedroom window. By the time she had wrapped her shawl and reached the lane, a thin column of smoke was rising from behind Cordelia Hartwell's cottage, and the distinctive scent told her immediately that someone was destroying documents with considerable urgency. Rose Wheeler stood in the garden with her hands pressed to her mouth, having arrived early to collect some of Cordelia's personal effects at Dr. Hartwell's request. "I saw the smoke from the high street," she explained breathlessly as Miss Marple approached. "Someone's been at the back room where Mrs. Hartwell kept her research papers." Constable Lake arrived within minutes, followed closely by Inspector Slack, whose satisfaction with his developing case against Miss Prescott was evident in his brisk efficiency. The fire had been small but targeted, confined to Cordelia's study where her historical research materials had been stored. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for and had worked with surgical precision to eliminate specific documents while leaving others untouched. "Deliberate destruction of evidence," Slack announced after examining the scene. "Someone's getting nervous about what we might find." He poked through the ashes with his pencil, noting how completely certain papers had been consumed while others remained barely singed. Professional job, this. Knew exactly which documents to target. Miss Marple observed the scene with particular attention to details that spoke of the perpetrator's character and methods. The room showed signs of hasty but organized searching, with items moved and replaced in a manner that suggested someone familiar with Cordelia's filing system. More tellingly, a small glass paperweight had been placed precisely in the corner of the desk, as if someone had instinctively tidied even while engaged in criminal destruction. Dr. Hartwell arrived shortly after, claiming to have been summoned by the smoke, though Miss Marple noted he was fully dressed despite the early hour and showed no signs of having been roused from sleep. His explanation that he had been called to attend Mrs. Pierce during the night struck her as particularly convenient, given the timing of the fire. "Such a terrible business," he declared, surveying the damage with what appeared to be appropriate concern. "Poor Cordelia's research, destroyed by some vandal. I do hope the authorities have sufficient evidence without these papers." Inspector Slack's examination revealed that whoever had conducted the search possessed intimate knowledge of Cordelia's work. The destroyed documents included specific correspondence with the War Office and pages carefully excised from the apothecary ledgers that had formed the backbone of her investigation. The cuts were precise, made with what appeared to be a scalpel or similarly sharp medical instrument, and showed none of the ragged edges that nervous haste typically produced. Most significantly, the perpetrator had left behind traces that spoke volumes about their identity and state of mind. A faint smear of wintergreen liniment on the door handle suggested someone who worked regularly with medicinal preparations, and the methodical nature of the destruction indicated medical training in handling delicate materials under pressure. When Miss Marple made inquiries with Mrs. Pierce about Dr. Hartwell's claimed nocturnal visit, the elderly woman was quite definite in her denial. "Bless you, no, Miss Marple. I sleep with my window cracked and would have heard a mouse on the garden path." "No, Doctor came near my door last night. I can assure you of that." This revelation cast Dr. Hartwell's alibi in an entirely different light, particularly when considered alongside his intimate knowledge of Cordelia's research and his obvious medical expertise. The man who had pronounced his wife dead with such professional certainty had also possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to ensure that death occurred at precisely the right moment. Inspector Slack, however, remained focused on his theory regarding Miss Prescott, interpreting the document destruction as further evidence of her family's desperation to conceal the wartime irregularities. "She's covering her tracks," he declared with satisfaction. "First the murder, now destroying the evidence. Won't do her any good, though. We've got enough to proceed." Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of hoping the inspector's confidence was premature. Her own observations had revealed a pattern of behavior that pointed in an entirely different direction, towards someone whose medical training had provided both the means and the method for committing the perfect crime. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when Timothy Hartwell returned from the county seat with disturbing news about his stepmother's correspondence. The War Office had confirmed receiving detailed reports about pharmaceutical irregularities during the post-war period, including specific allegations against a medical officer who had been diverting controlled substances for unauthorized civilian use. The correspondence was quite specific. Timothy explained to Miss Marple over tea. Stepmother had documentation showing systematic discrepancies between official requisitions and actual distributions, with the excess being sold privately at considerable profit. The officer in question had used his position to create a lucrative black market in medical supplies. This revelation provided the missing piece of motive that Miss Marple had been seeking. Dr. Hartwell's wartime service, which he had always described in terms of heroic medical intervention, had apparently included activities that could result in criminal charges if properly documented and presented to the authorities. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological profile of someone capable of such calculated deception. The killer had demonstrated not only medical knowledge and access to means, but also the cold-blooded ability to plan his wife's death while maintaining the appearance of a grieving widower. The forged warning label, the precise timing of the poison's administration, and the careful manipulation of evidence to suggest accidental death all spoke of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions and comfortable with exercising absolute control over outcomes. The destruction of evidence revealed another aspect of the killer's character. The arrogance that allowed him to believe he could manipulate the investigation's direction while eliminating threats to his carefully constructed deception. The winter-green liniment traces and the surgical precision of the document destruction had been unconscious signatures, betraying habits so ingrained that stress could not entirely suppress them. Walking through the village lanes as dusk gathered, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had revealed layers of deception that extended far beyond a simple domestic crime. Dr. Hartwell had constructed an elaborate fiction about his wartime service, his marriage to Cordelia, and his reaction to her historical research. Someone who could maintain such complex deceptions over years would certainly be capable of planning and executing a murder with the precision they had witnessed. The challenge now was to expose this carefully maintained facade without alerting Dr. Hartwell to the true direction of her suspicions. In her experience, cornered killers often proved more dangerous than those who believed themselves secure, and she had no desire to precipitate another tragedy in their small community. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a more direct approach to testing her theory, but one that would appear to support Inspector Slack's investigation, while actually revealing the truth about who had really poisoned Cordelia Hartwell in the midnight tea room. The village had suffered enough from the consequences of one person's desperate attempt to protect their reputation. She was determined to ensure that justice would finally be served, even if it meant exposing secrets that some would prefer to keep buried forever. The autumn night settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive tranquility, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, the final act of this deadly drama was about to begin. The morning light filtering through Miss Marple's cottage windows carried with it the clarity that often preceded significant revelations, though she had learned long ago that such moments required careful orchestration rather than dramatic confrontation. Her night of reflection had crystallized her understanding of Dr. Hartwell's guilt, but proving it would require the sort of delicate psychological maneuvering that had served her well in previous investigations. The challenge lay not in identifying the killer, but in creating circumstances where the truth would emerge naturally, without forcing a desperate man into potentially dangerous actions. Her first step was to arrange what she described to Inspector Slack as a clarification of witness recollections, suggesting that a reconstruction of the evening's events might resolve some lingering inconsistencies in the testimonies. Slack, whose confidence in his case against Miss Prescott remained unshaken, agreed readily to such a procedure, particularly when Miss Marple suggested it might strengthen the evidence against his preferred suspect. By mid-morning, the midnight tea room had been transformed once again into a stage for revelation, though this time under Miss Marple's careful direction, rather than Cordelia's theatrical ambitions. Rose Wheeler arrived first, her nervous energy channeled into the precise recreation of that fatal evening's arrangements. Under Miss Marple's gentle guidance, she positioned the lectern exactly as it had been, complete with teacup, saucer, cream jug, and the contested sugar bowl with its silver tongs. Miss Prescott entered with her characteristic punctuality, surveying the recreation with obvious disapproval of any deviation from proper standards. When asked to demonstrate how she had improved the tea service arrangement, she moved with brisk efficiency, straightening the papers and adjusting the chrysanthemum vase with quick, left-handed gestures. Most significantly, she positioned the sugar tongs with military precision, handles pointing directly toward the speaker's position in perfect parallel alignment. "One doesn't place tongs askew," she declared with characteristic firmness, demonstrating the exact positioning she considered appropriate. Miss Marple observed this careful arrangement with particular interest, noting how Miss Prescott's instinctive placement differed markedly from what had been observed on the night of the murder. Dr. Hartwell's arrival carried with it an undercurrent of tension that had not been present in his previous appearances. His apology for lateness, attributed to a patient emergency, came with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to providing explanations under pressure. Yet Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain in his manner, a slight tremor in his hands, an almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, and the way his gaze repeatedly returned to the sugar bowl arrangement. When Miss Marple, feigning the clumsiness of age, deliberately disturbed the sugar tongs and asked Dr. Hartwell to correct their placement with his neat fingers of a man accustomed to instruments, the result was precisely what she had anticipated. Without conscious thought, his right hand positioned the tongs at a clean diagonal, handles angled toward the speaker's right side, matching exactly the position she had observed on the night of Cordelia's death. Only after placing them did he notice Miss Prescott's disapproving frown and make a small adjustment toward the parallel positioning she preferred. The unconscious precision of that first placement revealed everything Miss Marple needed to confirm her suspicions. People returned to their own arrangements when they believed they were simply being helpful, and Dr. Hartwell's instinctive positioning matched the crime scene evidence perfectly. As the reconstruction continued, Miss Marple introduced what appeared to be casual observations about Cordelia's meticulous habits. "Rose tells me Mrs. Hartwell would never have written 'not for tea' on any label," she mentioned with apparent innocence. "Always 'not for infusion,' she would say. Such a stickler for proper terminology." The comment struck its target with surgical precision. Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple observed the subtle swallow that betrayed his recognition of the implication. The forged warning label had been created by someone unfamiliar with Cordelia's precise linguistic preferences, someone who had been working under considerable stress and time pressure. Her final gambit involved the seemingly innocent mention of carbon copies and duplicate records. "Such a sensible precaution modern ladies take," she observed mildly, making copies of important correspondence. "One hears that fires can be so unpredictable in their effects." Inspector Slack's sharp attention to this comment was matched by Dr. Hartwell's barely controlled reaction. The suggestion that Cordelia's research might not have been entirely destroyed clearly struck him as a possibility he had not adequately considered, and Miss Marple filed away his moment of visible calculation for future reference. Following the reconstruction, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Mr. Clement's natural prudence had preserved exactly what she had hoped to find. Cordelia's foresight in depositing copies of her most sensitive materials in the church safe had provided the insurance policy that would ultimately expose her killer. The sealed packet contained not only carbon copies of her correspondence with the War Office, but also her detailed presentation notes, including a telling observation, "Dr. H. to pour water for demonstration if hands tremble." This final detail revealed the cruel irony of Cordelia's murder. She had planned to enlist her husband's assistance in her presentation, trusting him to help with the very demonstration that would expose his wartime crimes. Whether he had intended to honor that small request after administering his larger betrayal remained a question that would haunt Miss Marple's reflections on human nature. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological profile that had emerged from her careful observations. Dr. Hartwell had demonstrated not only the medical knowledge necessary to prepare and administer a precise dose of digitalis, but also the cold calculation required to plan his wife's death while maintaining the facade of a grieving widower. His false alibi, the forged warning label, and the subsequent destruction of evidence all spoke of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions and comfortable with exercising absolute control over outcomes. The wintergreen traces found at Cordelia's cottage, the surgical precision of the document destruction, and the careful timing of the poison's administration all pointed to someone whose medical training had provided both means and method. Most damning of all was his unconscious return to the diagonal positioning of the sugar tongs, a habit so ingrained that stress could not entirely suppress it. By evening, Miss Marple had arranged what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a small gathering at the vicarage, entirely privately, for the comfort of closing matters before Sunday. The invitation, extended through the efficient network of village communication, brought together all the principal figures in the case under the guise of pastoral comfort and community healing. As the participants assembled in the vicarage sitting room, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe faces and hands without appearing to study either. The packet from the church safe rested innocuously on the mantel, its brown paper unremarkable among Mr. Clement's brass candlesticks. When the vicar mentioned, at Miss Marple's subtle prompting, that they had found some few notes Cordelia left for her own guidance, and that the War Office would receive corroboration in due course, the effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Hartwell's eyes went directly to the packet on the mantel, and in that moment of unguarded calculation, Miss Marple saw the confirmation she had been seeking. The man who had murdered his wife to protect his secrets was now calculating whether another crime might be necessary to preserve his freedom. As the evening progressed with careful normalcy, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance she was maintaining. The truth was now clear to her, but exposing it would require one final, carefully orchestrated moment when Dr. Hartwell's guilt would become undeniable to everyone present. The challenge lay in creating that moment without precipitating the desperate action of a cornered killer who had already demonstrated his willingness to commit murder to protect his carefully constructed life. The stage was set for the final revelation, and Miss Marple prepared herself for the delicate task of unmasking a killer who had hidden behind the respected facade of a village physician for far too long. The vicarage sitting room possessed that peculiar atmosphere of enforced civility stretched over barely contained tensions, where polite conversation masked the knowledge that someone among them had committed murder. Miss Marple observed how each participant had positioned themselves, noting the unconscious revelations in their choices. Dr. Hartwell near the door, suggesting a man who valued escape routes. Miss Prescott, rigidly upright, armor of propriety intact. Timothy, hunched in the corner chair, bearing the weight of terrible suspicions about his father. The brown packet on the mantelpiece seemed to draw every eye despite its unremarkable appearance, and Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe the subtle shifts in expression that accompanied each glance toward it. Inspector Slack, convinced of his case against Miss Prescott, maintained the satisfied air of a man whose investigation was proceeding exactly as planned, though Miss Marple noticed his attention beginning to shift as the evening's true purpose became apparent. Mr. Clement began with characteristic pastoral gentleness, speaking of healing and understanding, but Miss Marple gently interrupted with the diffident manner of someone uncertain of her welcome. "I fear there has been some confusion about certain details of Mrs. Hartwell's death," she said, her voice carrying the apologetic tone that had lulled many criminals into complacency over the years. "Small things, really, but they do tend to accumulate into rather significant patterns. She rose from her chair with deliberate care and moved toward the mantelpiece, her movements unhurried but purposeful. Mrs. Hartwell was, by all accounts, a woman of precise habits and careful methods. Take, for instance, her approach to labeling her herbal preparations. She paused, allowing her gaze to rest briefly on Dr. Hartwell. Rose Wheeler tells me that Cordelia would never have written "not for tea" on any label. Always "not for infusion," she would say, or "for external use only." Such a stickler for proper terminology was our Cordelia. Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple filed away this small reaction before continuing. Someone, perhaps working under considerable stress, created that warning label without understanding her precise linguistic preferences. The scratched-through original and hasty relabeling suggested unfamiliarity with her methods. Moving to the tea service Mr. Clement had arranged, Miss Marple lifted the sugar tongs with careful attention. Then there was the matter of these tongs' positioning that evening. "Miss Prescott, you demonstrated how you always arrange them, handles parallel to the table edge, most proper and correct." Miss Prescott nodded with satisfaction at having her standards acknowledged. But we observed that on the night of the tragedy they were found at a distinct diagonal, handles angled toward the speaker's right side, rather revealing about the handedness of whoever had used them last. Inspector Slack's attention had begun to shift noticeably from Miss Prescott to Dr. Hartwell, whose professional composure was showing hairline cracks under Miss Marple's gentle but relentless pressure. Timothy watched his father with growing horror, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place in his young mind. The digitalis itself presented the most telling evidence, Miss Marple continued conversationally. Such a potent substance, requiring precise knowledge of dosage to ensure rapid, fatal effects while minimizing opportunity for intervention. The speed with which it acted suggested a carefully calculated, concentrated preparation, knowledge not commonly found outside the medical profession. She retrieved the brown packet from the mantelpiece, untying its string with methodical care. Fortunately, Cordelia's meticulous nature extended to her research methods. Carbon copies, duplicate records, witness statements carefully preserved. She understood that serious allegations required serious documentation. Her voice carried gentle emphasis as she continued. Her presentation notes are quite illuminating. She had planned to discuss pharmaceutical irregularities during the post-war period, systematic diversion of controlled substances by medical personnel for unauthorized civilian distribution. Dr. Hartwell had gone quite pale, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. "These are historical matters," he said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional dignity. "Complex wartime situations that civilians might not fully understand." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while consulting another sheet from the packet. Indeed, which is why Cordelia was so careful to obtain corroboration from multiple sources. She even made notes about the evening's presentation itself. She paused, her gentle voice carrying devastating irony. "Dr. H. to pour water for demonstration if hands tremble." Such a thoughtful wife, planning to include her husband in the very presentation that would expose his crimes. The cruel revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Timothy made a small, choked sound, while Miss Prescott's eyes widened with dawning comprehension. Inspector Slack had abandoned all pretense of casual interest and was watching Dr. Hartwell with the focused attention of a professional preparing for action. "The wintergreen liniment, traces at Cordelia's cottage," Miss Marple continued inexorably. "The surgical precision of the document destruction, the false alibi about attending Mrs. Pierce, who enjoyed an undisturbed night, I've confirmed. All pointing to someone with medical training who possessed both means and opportunity." Dr. Hartwell's control finally shattered under the accumulated weight of evidence. "She was going to destroy everything," he burst out, his professional mask falling away to reveal the desperate man beneath. 30 years of respected practice, my reputation, my standing in the community, all for the sake of historical accuracy about events that happened decades ago. Miss Marple regarded him with the patient sympathy she might show a distressed patient. The wartime irregularities were quite serious, weren't they, Doctor? Systematic theft of controlled substances sold at considerable profit to civilians who couldn't obtain proper medical care through official channels. People were suffering, he said, though the justification rang hollow. The official distribution system was inadequate. I was helping people who needed treatment, while charging them substantially more than official rates, Miss Marple observed, without condemnation. Cordelia's research had uncovered the financial records that proved the scope of your activities. The missing page 8 of her presentation contained the specific evidence that would have supported criminal charges. The confession, when it came, carried the terrible relief of a man who had carried an unbearable secret for too long. In halting phrases, Dr. Hartwell described the careful preparation of concentrated digitalis dissolved in a specially prepared sugar cube and placed where Cordelia would never think to look. The poison had been designed to act swiftly, creating the appearance of natural death while he maintained the perfect alibi of the grieving widower who had tried desperately to save his wife. As Inspector Slack moved forward with handcuffs, Timothy turned away, unable to watch his father's final disgrace. Miss Prescott sat in stunned silence, her moral certainties shaken by the revelation that respectability could mask such calculated evil. The vicarage sitting room, which had witnessed so many moments of pastoral comfort and community healing, had become the stage for a reckoning that would haunt St. Mary Mead for years to come. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag with quiet satisfaction, reflecting that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. The secrets that Cordelia Hartwell had died trying to expose would now see the light of day, though at a cost that no historical accuracy could ever justify. As the official proceedings began, Miss Marple slipped quietly into the autumn evening, leaving behind a community forever changed by the knowledge that murder could hide behind the most trusted facade, and that the truth, however carefully buried, would always find a way to surface in the end. The days following Dr. Hartwell's confession settled over St. Mary Mead like autumn mist, bringing with them a peculiar mixture of relief and unease that Miss Marple had observed in other communities forced to confront the reality of murder in their midst. The respected physician who had delivered their children and tended their ailments had proven capable of the most calculated deception, and this revelation had shaken the village's faith in its ability to judge character and motive with their usual confidence. Inspector Slack departed the next morning with his prisoner, and a grudging respect for Miss Marple's observational skills that he would carry into future investigations. His final words to her, delivered with the awkward formality of a man unaccustomed to acknowledging assistance from elderly ladies, were that he would welcome her small observations sooner rather than later in any future cases. Miss Marple accepted this tribute with characteristic modesty, though she reflected privately that the art of detection often lay in noticing the very details that official investigations overlooked in their pursuit of obvious motives and surface evidence. Timothy Hartwell faced the most complex adjustment of all, bearing not only the grief of losing his stepmother, but the terrible burden of his father's guilt. With Mr. Pembroke's guidance and the vicar's pastoral support, he began the painful process of cooperating fully with the War Office investigation, ensuring that Cordelia's research would finally achieve its intended purpose of bringing wartime irregularities to official attention. The young man's decision to pursue his studies at university, made with quiet determination rather than anyone's permission, suggested a character strengthened rather than broken by tragedy. Miss Prescott withdrew into rigid propriety following her brief period as a suspect, though Miss Marple detected subtle changes in her demeanor that suggested the experience had introduced unwelcome complexity into a previously certain moral universe. When she finally returned to her usual routines, there was a new quality to her silence, as if she had discovered that truth did not always align neatly with appearances, and that respectability could mask the most shocking deceptions. The midnight tea room itself faced an uncertain future until Rose Wheeler, with characteristic practical wisdom, proposed transforming it into a quiet reading room that would serve tea without theatrical pretensions. The establishment reopened 2 weeks later as a simple, comfortable space where villagers could gather for conversation and companionship without the dramatic lighting and elaborate arrangements that had characterized Cordelia's ambitious vision. Mrs. Bantry declared it much improved, and since her opinion carried considerable influence, others felt permitted to agree. The War Office investigation, aided by Timothy's cooperation and the documents preserved in the church safe, revealed the full scope of Dr. Hartwell's wartime activities. The systematic diversion of pharmaceutical supplies had generated substantial illegal profits while exploiting desperate civilians who couldn't obtain proper medical care through official channels. The moral complexity of these revelations troubled the community, as Dr. Hartwell's victims had indeed been suffering people who needed treatment, yet his willingness to commit murder to conceal his activities revealed a character far more calculating than charitable. Mr. Clement's Sunday sermon, delivered to a congregation still processing the shock of recent events, addressed themes of hidden sin and the importance of confession without directly referencing the tragedy. His text from Luke's Gospel about secrets being made manifest struck the assembled villagers with particular force, causing subtle shifts in posture and expression that suggested personal reflection on their own hidden compromises and moral complexities. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple observed the gradual process by which the village absorbed the trauma of discovering a killer in their midst. Conversations became more guarded initially, trust more conditional, and the easy assumptions about character that had previously governed social interactions required careful reconstruction. Yet human nature, in her long experience, possessed remarkable resilience, and gradually the rhythms of daily life reasserted themselves, with only subtle changes to mark what had transpired. Walking through the village lanes on a crisp December morning, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons the midnight tea room tragedy had revealed about the relationship between past and present. Cordelia Hartwell's historical research had been more than academic curiosity. It had been an attempt to understand how hidden actions continued to shape current events, and her murder had ironically proven the continued relevance of buried secrets. The capacity for deception that Dr. Hartwell had demonstrated existed in smaller degrees in everyone, and the challenge of living in community required constant vigilance against the temptation to prioritize personal interests over moral obligations. The case had also confirmed Miss Marple's long-held belief that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, protected by professional standing and social position from the suspicion their actions merited. Dr. Hartwell's medical knowledge had provided both the means and the method for committing what should have been the perfect crime, yet his very precision had ultimately betrayed him through unconscious habits and ingrained behaviors that stress could not entirely suppress. As she reached her garden gate and paused to observe the winter preparations visible in cottage windows throughout St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple considered the fragile nature of the social bonds that held communities together. Trust, once broken by the revelation of such fundamental deception, required careful rebuilding, and the process would take time and patience from everyone involved. The village would continue, life would resume its familiar patterns, but the knowledge of what had transpired would remain part of their collective memory, a reminder that appearances could deceive and that the human heart could harbor darkness even behind the most trusted facades. Settling into her sitting room with her knitting and a cup of tea, taken without sugar as she reflected with gentle irony, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Cordelia Hartwell's determination to expose historical truth had cost her life, but her research would now ensure that wartime crimes, long hidden, would face official scrutiny. The midnight tea room would continue under Rose's capable management, serving as a place of simple fellowship rather than theatrical revelation. And perhaps that was the most fitting memorial to a woman whose passion for truth had ultimately triumphed over the forces that had sought to silence her. The autumn evening that had begun with such civilized promise and ended in murder had taught St. Mary Mead that even the most peaceful villages were not immune to the darker aspects of human nature. But it had also demonstrated the power of careful observation and patient deduction to unmask even the most sophisticated deceptions, ensuring that truth, however carefully buried, would always find a way to surface in the end. The inquest, held in the drafty assembly room above the Crown Inn, drew villagers with the mixture of morbid curiosity and civic duty that such proceedings invariably inspired. The coroner's verdict of willful murder by administration of digitalis was delivered with clinical precision, though Miss Marple observed how the familiar faces in the gallery flinched at each technical detail. Dr. Hartwell, remanded for trial at the summer assizes, maintained his professional composure even in the dock, though she noted the tremor in his hands when the evidence of his systematic wartime fraud was presented alongside the murder charge. Timothy sat with Mr. Pembroke and did not look toward his father, his young face bearing the gravity of someone forced to mature far too quickly. The investigation had expanded beyond the original pharmaceutical irregularities to encompass a network of medical officers who had exploited post-war chaos for personal gain. Timothy's cooperation with the authorities had revealed correspondence suggesting corruption across several counties, transforming what had begun as historical research into a contemporary criminal matter of considerable scope. Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple afterward with the awkward formality of someone unaccustomed to acknowledging assistance from elderly ladies. Those sugar tongs were a bit of a facer, he admitted without quite meeting her eyes. Obliged for certain observations that adjusted my line of thinking. Miss Marple replied mildly that small details were often the most dangerous when one grew accustomed to overlooking them, and Slack departed with grudging respect that would influence his approach to future investigations. The winter month that followed brought a gradual transformation that Miss Marple observed with her characteristic patience. Snow fell early, blanketing St. Mary Mead in pristine white that seemed to muffle not only sound, but also the lingering echoes of autumn's tragedy. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, the community processed the profound shock of discovering that their trusted physician had been capable of such calculated deception. Mrs. Bantry's morning visits became reliable sources of intelligence about how various households were adapting. The baker's wife had consulted 3 different doctors before settling on Dr. Hartwell's replacement, unable to trust her judgment about medical practitioners after such devastating revelation. Mrs. Pierce had begun locking her doors at night for the first time in 70 years, declaring that if a respectable doctor could commit murder, anyone might be capable of anything. Miss Prescott's evolution proved most intriguing to observe. Her brief period as a suspect had introduced unwelcome complexity into her previously rigid world view, and she gradually resumed her routines with subtly altered demeanor. Her morning visits to the post office now included genuine conversations rather than perfunctory exchanges, and when she contributed to the church poor fund, it was with a sealed envelope containing what Mr. Clement discreetly described as a substantial gesture of conscience. The discovery that respectability could mask shocking deceptions had taught her that human nature was more complex than her moral certainties had previously allowed. Timothy returned from his first university term with accelerated maturity that spoke of painful lessons learned. His studies in history and law, he explained to Miss Marple during a January visit, were motivated by determination to understand how systematic deception could flourish unchecked for decades. Stepmother was right about historical accuracy, he reflected with quiet intensity. Without her research, these crimes would have remained hidden forever. The War Office investigation had revealed that Dr. Hartwell's activities were part of a larger conspiracy involving medical equipment, hospital provisions, and scarce medicines during the post-war influenza epidemic, costing civilian lives through delayed treatment for those unable to pay black market prices. The reading room that replaced the midnight tea room thrived under Rose Wheeler's understated management. The dramatic lighting had been replaced with comfortable reading lamps, burgundy tablecloths with simple white linen, and elaborate arrangements with modest seasonal decorations. Most significantly, the lectern where Cordelia had made her final presentation was replaced by a bookshelf containing volumes of local history, including carefully edited versions of her research that preserved historical value while protecting personal sensitivities. As spring arrived early, bringing news that Dr. Hartwell's trial would encompass both murder and extensive wartime fraud, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had revealed the continuing influence of past events on present circumstances. Cordelia's research had been more than academic exercise. It had been an attempt to understand how hidden actions continued to shape community relationships. The murder had ironically proven the continued relevance of buried secrets, demonstrating that the past could never be entirely escaped, only temporarily concealed. Walking through village lanes on a warm May morning, Miss Marple observed the gradual process by which St. Mary Mead had absorbed its trauma. The easy trust that had once characterized neighborly interactions was now tempered with new caution, a quiet questioning of appearances. People preferred their villains clearly identifiable as outsiders. Discovering evil behind a trusted facade had stripped away comforting illusions about their community's immunity to human darkness. Yet the investigation had also demonstrated the power of careful observation to unmask sophisticated deceptions. Dr. Hartwell's very precision had betrayed him through unconscious habits that stress could not suppress. The diagonal positioning of sugar tongs, the uncharacteristic phrasing on forged labels, the surgical cuts in destroyed documents. His medical knowledge had provided both means and method for what should have been the perfect crime, but perfection in human affairs invariably betrayed itself through the very precision of its execution. The case reinforced Miss Marple's conviction that the most dangerous deceptions were woven with threads of truth. Dr. Hartwell had not been entirely wrong claiming he had helped people. He had provided medical care when official channels failed. But his self-serving narrative conveniently omitted exorbitant prices, exploitation of scarcity, and systematic theft that underpinned his supposed philanthropy. This insidious blend of good and evil, genuine need and calculated greed, made his crimes particularly chilling and his character difficult for villagers to reconcile with their previous image. As summer approached and the trial date neared, Miss Marple tended her garden with particular attention to the foxgloves along her wall. She had decided against removing them entirely, choosing instead proper labeling and careful positioning. Dangerous things, she reflected, were best dealt with through knowledge and distance rather than panic, a philosophy that applied equally to plants and people. Settling into her sitting room on a peaceful June evening, Miss Marple took up her knitting with satisfaction that justice would finally be served through proper legal channels. The midnight tea-room tragedy had taught St. Mary Mead that even peaceful communities were not immune to human darkness, but it had also shown that courage and determination, exemplified by Cordelia's relentless pursuit of truth, could ultimately triumph over forces seeking to keep dangerous secrets buried. The rhythms of daily life had reasserted themselves with the hard-won wisdom that appearances could deceive and human hearts could harbor darkness behind the most trusted facades. Yet the community had also learned that truth, however carefully buried, would always find a way to surface in the end. As her needles clicked softly in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected that no deception, however cleverly wrought, could long withstand the gentle yet unyielding scrutiny of careful observation and patient deduction. Human nature, she had long observed, always left a corner sticking up, and that, in the end, was how one unpicked it, gently and in good time, until what lay beneath could no longer pretend to be something else. The summer assizes brought Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell's reckoning with a precision that would have satisfied even Cordelia's exacting standards for historical accuracy. Miss Marple, called as a witness, traveled to the county courthouse with Mrs. Bantry and Timothy, observing how the young man had acquired the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry difficult truths without being crushed by their weight. The proceedings unfolded with methodical thoroughness that stripped away any remaining illusions about the respected physician's character. The prosecution's case built systematically from the War Office documents detailing pharmaceutical theft through to the carefully planned murder that had silenced the one person capable of exposing these crimes. When the forensic evidence was presented, the microscopic shavings from the underside of sugar cubes, invisible from above, the telltale scratches on silver tongs from medical instruments rather than household drawers, the surgical precision of cuts in destroyed documents. The jury heard not just proof of guilt, but testimony to the killer's medical expertise turned to murderous purpose. Miss Marple's testimony provided the psychological insights that transformed physical evidence into human understanding. She described, with characteristic understatement, how unconscious habits had betrayed conscious deception, the diagonal positioning of sugar tongs revealing handedness, the uncharacteristic phrasing on hastily forged labels, the wintergreen traces that spoke of medical rather than domestic familiarity. Her gentle observations carried particular weight because they demonstrated how the killer's very precision had ultimately exposed him. Timothy's testimony proved the emotional cornerstone of the proceedings. Speaking with quiet determination that impressed even the court stenographer, he presented Cordelia's preserved research and described his decision to cooperate fully with authorities despite the personal cost. When asked about his father's character, Timothy replied simply that he had loved the man he thought his father was, while recognizing his duty to prevent further harm from the man his father had actually become. The verdict of guilty on both murder and fraud charges surprised no one who had followed the evidence, though hearing it pronounced carried the finality that even Dr. Hartwell's confession had not provided. The judge's remarks about the perversion of medical training to serve criminal ends resonated through the courtroom, emphasizing how professional trust had been systematically betrayed over decades of apparently respectable practice. As autumn returned to St. Mary Mead, the village had absorbed its trauma while preserving the essential qualities that made neighborly life possible. Miss Prescott emerged from her experience as a suspect subtly transformed, her rigid moral certainties tempered by new understanding that appearances could deceive and that mercy was not the same as pretending nothing grievous had happened. Her contributions to the Church Poor Fund now came in sealed envelopes containing what Mr. Clement discreetly described as substantial gestures of conscience. Timothy returned from university during the Christmas holidays with accelerated maturity and clear purpose. His studies in law and history, he explained to Miss Marple during a visit, were motivated by determination to understand how systematic deception could flourish unchecked for decades. Stepmother was right about historical accuracy, he reflected with quiet intensity. Without her research, these crimes would have remained hidden forever, and the pattern might have continued in other places, with other victims. The reading room flourished under Rose Wheeler's understated management, becoming the social center Cordelia had envisioned, though without the theatrical pretensions that had characterized the original midnight tea room. A small brass plaque near the bookshelf, installed at Timothy's request, simply read, "In memory of Cordelia Hartwell, who believed that truth matters," serving as both tribute and reminder that courage in pursuing facts could triumph over forces seeking to keep dangerous secrets buried. Rose had preserved one element of Cordelia's dramatic vision, a small collection of local history volumes, including carefully edited versions of her research that maintained historical value while protecting personal sensitivities. The War Office investigation had expanded far beyond Dr. Hartwell's individual crimes to encompass a network of corruption that had exploited post-war chaos for personal gain, ensuring that historical justice would finally be served even decades after the original offenses. Walking through village lanes on a crisp December evening, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had revealed the continuing influence of past events on present circumstances. Hidden actions shaped current relationships in ways that participants rarely recognized, and the capacity for deception existed in varying degrees throughout human nature. The challenge of living in community required constant vigilance against the temptation to prioritize personal interests over moral obligations while maintaining the trust necessary for social bonds to function. As she reached her cottage and settled into her sitting room with her knitting, Miss Marple took up her needles with quiet satisfaction that justice had been properly served. The case had confirmed her long-held belief that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, protected by professional standing and social position from the suspicion their actions merited. Yet it had also demonstrated that no deception, however cleverly constructed, could long withstand the gentle yet unyielding scrutiny of careful observation and patient deduction. The midnight tea-room tragedy had begun with one woman's determination to expose historical truth and had ended with the revelation that some secrets were indeed worth killing to protect, though the killing had ultimately ensured their exposure rather than their concealment. Cordelia Hartwell's research had achieved its intended purpose, though at a cost that no historical accuracy could justify. Outside her window, the village slept peacefully under winter stars, its residents secure in the knowledge that truth, however carefully buried, would always find a way to surface in the end. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected as her needles clicked, softly in the lamplight, invariably left a corner sticking up somewhere, and that, in the end, was how one unpicked even the most cunningly woven deceptions, gently and in good time, until what lay beneath could no longer pretend to be something else. The rhythms of daily life in St. Mary Mead continued with the hard-won wisdom that respectability could mask shocking darkness, yet also with renewed appreciation for genuine virtue when it was encountered. Communities, like individuals, grew stronger through surviving their trials, and the gentle art of careful observation would always be necessary to distinguish between those who genuinely served others and those who merely used service as a mask for selfish ambition. As the church clock chimed midnight, the hour that had given Cordelia's establishment its name, Miss Marple reflected that justice, like truth, rarely arrived with theatrical flourish. It came instead on quiet feet, with small corrections at the exact moment when someone finally noticed that a familiar thing was just slightly, tellingly, out of place.